is a real pleasure today because I'm Paula Harris and I am interviewing Grant Cameron. And what I'd like to do, my dream has always been to do a lecture series on consciousness. And because I believe that consciousness is very much related to the UFO phenomenon, the whole entire phenomenon is interconnected. And Grant and I have the honor of having started with nuts and bolts. I started with Dr. J. Allen Hynek in 1980, just putting pens and maps and looking at sightings and physical traces cases, and did the whole gamut of nuts and bolts. And Grant started probably way before that. I'll let him talk about his advent to consciousness. But we both, Grant with documents and with presidential involvement, has also started to be interested in consciousness and consciousness raising. And because we both believe this is the bottom line, we would like to talk about how we got there, and we would like to add to it that maybe it's the valid explanation for the whole mysterious phenomenon. Today is October 27th, 2019. This kind of document, I hope, will be historical for all our children and our children's children's children. I consider everything we do historical.
Exactly.
It's not entertainment.
Exactly.
So I feel that Grant, I'm so honored you're here because I've always said, I remember when I first met you at the X conference, you were the one to help me with my PowerPoint. I was having trouble.
Oh,
yeah. I was like, and I was having trouble with my PowerPoint, and you said, I'll help you, and you gave me the computer, and we worked. And we've done a lot of X conferences together with Stephen Bassett.
Yeah.
And all of this was an effort for disclosure. And so I began to listen to Grant's presentations and realized he was really plugged in, especially where he's a field researcher. Can you very quickly tell us how you went from all of this document stuff, and we know about your Charlie Red Star contact in Winnipeg, that got you peeked into the UFO phenomenon, and then all the document stuff to where we are now? I mean, can you talk about it?
Well, basically, I look at it now like I was maybe the guy with the silver spoon, because nothing I ever did, I really think I figured out. I was given everything. I didn't intend to have a UFO sighting. I have a UFO sighting. I get fascinated with what I saw. I put a manuscript together, this in the 1970s. Nobody is interested. And I said, this is a waste of time. And so I had started with a question is, I saw something, somebody has to know what that was that I saw. I don't understand it, but somebody's got to know. So I started this search to go to the highest level person I could to figure out what was going on. So I went to Canadian government first, which went to Dr. Eric Walker, the former president of Penn State University. He was going to give his files to the Truman Library. Went to the president. I figured, well, the president's got to know what's going on. And I went through that chain, and then I chased the top scientists of the CIA, and I chased all these very high-level people trying to figure out what are they saying, listening to what they're saying as to what they knew. And then what happens is I do all the presidential stuff, and I do the disclosure stuff. And in 2012, I have what I now know as a noetic experience. And this is an experience where you have your left brain that figures things out, it adds and subtracts and does all this kind of stuff. And then I had this noetic experience, which is something like, to give you an example, remote viewing. Remote viewing is something that comes in, you didn't figure it out. It just came into your head from somewhere else, wherever it's coming, the field, whatever you want to call it. So I'm in 2012, February 26th, I'm at a consciousness lecture with Colin Andrews. And I always say, in 2012, I could not spell the word consciousness, and I couldn't have cared less. I had no interest whatsoever. I'm in this lecture with Colin Andrews, and I talk about contact modalities, how people get into the field, various methods that people can get into this field and get this noetic material, which is real material, knowledge into the field. So I had a situation where I'm sitting there watching Colin Andrews. I'm not interested in crop circles. I'm only there because he's a prominent researcher. And I'm sitting there and I suddenly zone out. I guess I went into the field and I had 3 items that I had worked on. It wasn't new, so it was these 3 items that I'd worked on in my life. And it took the three items, put them together like a puzzle, and said, "This is how it works." And it was an enlightening experience, a download, noetic experience. It just suddenly, it was there, and I suddenly realized this is about consciousness. And at first I thought it was just consciousness, just thinking and stuff like that, and ESP, and then I realized it was much more complex. It had to do with there's no time and space, the mind is non-local, all this kind of stuff. And as I've gone along since that day, where my world just completely flipped upside down. It was like when I had my UFO sighting, my world completely shifted. The people that were with me when I had my first UFO sighting went on with their life, and I just went like crazy. I went like, "Whoa, what's going on here?" And same thing in 2012. So I have this thing, and then in about 2016, I have a second one, a second noetic experience, which is much more complex.
Where are you then?
I'm in Winnipeg. This is in fall. It's very cold, and what I do to get these sort of enlightenment experiences is I walk. So people will meditate, or they'll om, or they'll do channeling or whatever they do. But I walk. So I'm walking downtown. It's a 6 mile walk.
Because what you're doing really is quieting the
left brain.
side, left brain, because you're doing a mechanical thing.
Yeah, and it's sort of almost like Colin Andrews. It puts it the mind, the little voice quietens down, and so the idea that I've developed since then from this is that the left brain is chattering, and it's saying this, that, you're a good person, you're a bad person, this and that. And once you can quiet that voice down and all that noise, you pick up the signal. And that's what remote viewing is. You quiet the mind. If Russell Targ talks about it, you quiet the mind, but I say it's the left brain, and you cut out all the signal, and suddenly it's like, oh, and you're picking up you quiet the noise and you pick up the signal. So in 2016, I'm walking downtown, and I walk 2 miles to McDonald's. I have my coffee, and I'm starting the next round, walking down the street, and I can feel it coming. It's like, you need a piece of paper, you gotta write this down. And it started to come, and it had a number of things that came, which were much more important than the 2012. And basically what it said to me in 2016 in this noetic experience was, okay, and it was like a comparison thing. It wasn't words or anything. It was just sort of like a feeling, and it said, okay, if the world is made out of nuts and bolts, then that's one world, and it has all its rules and all this sort of stuff. But if that's wrong, if it's made out of consciousness, if consciousness is primary and it creates the nuts and bolts, that's a completely different world, and there's completely different rules. You got to rewrite all the rules. And then it was like, are things separate? So are you and I separate, or are we part of one thing? Do we all come from the same
Maybe you
thing?
could say, are we part of the field?
Yeah, are we part of the whole thing?
The whole entire thing. It's all one thing.
And that was part of my first experience.
Mm-hmm.
I had three things that came in the first experience. One was a top secret memo that Canadians had written. And there was a line in the document which I'd lectured about it, but I'd never talked about it. And that was, we were told by American officials that other things might be associated with the flying saucers, such as mental phenomena. That's 1950. That's 2 years before Adamski had the first sort of contact with a being. So nobody knew there was beings. So how did the Americans know the mental phenomena was part of the UFO thing in 1950? And the second one was with this thing where it's all connected, was Jan Hartson has a sighting when he's like 9 years old. He becomes fascinated, and he wants to know how UFOs work, and he does all this, becomes an electrical engineer. He comes up against Lockheed Skunk Works guy, Ben Rich, who runs it,
yeah.
and it's always been rumored that Lockheed Skunk Works is doing the back engineering, and so he's fascinated. He realizes he wants to ask Ben Rich. He said, I've studied this my whole life. I need to know, how do they get here? How does the propulsion system work? And Ben Rich turns around and says, what do you know about ESP? And Jan goes, it means everything in time and space is connected, that's how it works, and walks off. And that's exactly what Dr. Eric Walker had told us 2 years before, and he was 14 honorary doctorate degrees, co-developer of the homing torpedo, the head of the Jasons. He had developed the Jasons. He was on DARPA. He was the chairman of the science board for the United States. He was like this big guy, and we were talking to him at one point, and at one point 2 years before Ben Rich makes a statement, he says, let me ask you a question. And they're talking about MJ12 and all this kind of stuff and who's controlling the thing. Let me ask you a question. What do you know about ESP? And the guy that was interviewing him had no idea. And he said, look, let me tell you something. Unless you understand about ESP works, about ESP and how it works, you will not be taken in by the control group. Very few people understand how it works. So those are the three things that came into my head. But in 2013 or in 2016, it was the other one. It was the idea. Is it separate, or is it all one? Is it all connected? And it's the same principle. And then it was like the other things that came to me was, is the world random? Because that's what we're taught. It's random,
Right.
or accidents, or it's just particles banging into each other. It's a random, meaningless universe. If that's one world, if you have that thing, and you can make sort of laws about it, and you can get so far. But if it's a pattern, if it's following a pattern, if the universe is growing and it's learning, that's a different world. So I had 24 things. There was maybe 15, 16 came, and then I put my glove back on, I kept walking again, and then I could feel it's coming again. I get the glove off, get the paper, and I wrote these down.
You said something amazing. You said, if the universe is growing and learning, because you're making it an active
Yeah.
universe,
Yeah.
of which we are part, which
Sure.
you know, would be fascinating, then what happened to you, and I know this happened to me, is we change our perception of reality.
Oh, absolutely. Everything changed for me. That's the thing. It just flipped my world upside down. Like when related to what you just said, one of the things was, is it a verb or is it a noun? So we say it's a noun. So you say
It's consciousness.
We say
Is it a verb
there's
or
a
is
brain
it a noun?
and then there's the consciousness.
Yeah.
And then there's like, no, it's a verb. It's all consciousness. It's
Yeah.
all the brain is inside consciousness. The mind is inside consciousness. The world is inside consciousness. There is only consciousness, but we want to do the left brain always wants to take over. So left brain says we need to understand this. So then you say, oh, there's these different levels and there's different colors and we make all these elaborate things.
And you put people in an MRI, you watch what part of the brain.
Yeah, and it's
like
all these
so,
nouns. So they're describing it, and it's
Yeah.
almost like give it a name and make it go away. And I always describe the thing about the separation of a cell. So they say, oh, it's just a cell dividing. And I said, well, no, you're making it a noun. You give it a name. Okay, it's a separation of a cell, and it's a noun. But it's actually a thing where you take a cell, makes a second cell. It takes 100 trillion atoms, and it takes them in 16 hours. It puts them in the three-dimensional position, and that is able to duplicate itself. And you're going, no, it's all a verb. And when you see it's all alive and it's all conscious. And so when I started to do the research, like on psychedelics, people who have psychedelic, the real, like the ayahuasca, say they suddenly realized their ego was crushed, and they realized everything was alive and connected. And that's the concept that we're starting to come into in ufology, is we're starting to realize the whole connectedness of the universe and the fact that it's alive. And that's where I come to consciousness, where I say to researchers, and I don't care what they say, I say, whatever this is, it's going to be a lot less physical than you think it is. It's going to be a lot more spiritual than you think it is. And if you understand what's underlying the UFO phenomena, it's not aliens, ships, stuff like that. You understand the underlying thing, you are in the Super Bowl of all stories. This is the story that explains how does the universe works. And one of the examples was your friend Jacques Vallée writes volume 4 of Forbidden Science, and he talks about how the NIDS group started in 1995. He was there, and he talks about the fact that Bob Bigelow had donated $3.7 million to the University of Las Vegas, Nevada, for consciousness studies, a chair on consciousness studies. And because his son had died, and the two things that they wanted to work on, and everybody thinks, oh, NIDS has got,
metal
and they got all this
yeah,
stuff
it's
in
all
crafts,
scientific
and they're
and
going
so
to back
forth.
engine. And yet, when you look at what Jacques Vallée says, the two things that he wanted to study were, number one was UFOs, and one was life after death, or survival of death.
Exactly.
And then the one guy was all these scientists, and the one guy was like shocked, and it's like, why are we picking these topics? Why don't we just pick ESP and Sasquatch? And he said, no, because UFOs, we can do some measurements and analysis and stuff, and because life after death is the ultimate question. Then that's what it comes down to. So you discover what happens at death, you discover everything, and that's what we're doing. Because if you look at Whitley Strieber does the book Communion, and then he gets 200,000 letters, and his wife Anne comes out of the room, and she says to Whitley, whatever we're dealing with has something to do with death. And so it ties the whole thing in. So the UFO thing is to understand, how does the universe work? How are we really doing? How did we come into the world? Is it one of the things I got in the thing? If it's one life, then that's one world. But if it's multiple lives, if it's reincarnation, everything changes. All the rules change. You have to rethink things. So you get this thing that if you realize that maybe we have multiple lives, you and I both came into the world to do something. When we leave, they're just going to ask you one question: how did it work out? Because you're the one that planned it. You're the one that put all the players in. You're the one that decided, and everybody says the same thing: I could have done better. So in the world, we have situations where people are competing, and to me, it's very simple. You came in, I came in. We came in for a reason. And all we have to do is worry about, why did I come into the world? What am I supposed to be doing? Am I doing it? Because when I leave, they're going to say, how did it work out? And everybody says the same thing, I could have done better. You don't have to worry about what everybody else is doing. It's just, so it becomes, you take personal responsibility. I came in, I'm taking personal responsibility for what I'm doing. And you realize that it's this multiple world. It's not just the world of the physical world where you die. It's this multiple world where it's multiple lives.
It's all a field. And the thing,
yeah.
and I love the way you're explaining this, because you're really going to the bottom line. I mean, you're talking about the life after death. You're talking about our being one with the universe. You're talking about the universe expressing itself. And I listened to a David Icke lecture, and he said consciousness interacts with consciousness. And we got to remember, consciousness is not in the brain. It's a field. You can't measure it. It's not going to go
I would say it's more than a field. I would say it's all that there is.
It's all that there is.
We're doing the noun thing again. People still move it back. They say, okay, there's a brain, and then there's consciousness. And it's like, no, it's all consciousness.
It's all consciousness.
It's almost like the way you know my assistant Dessa, she has this download experience where she sees the beginning of the universe. And I see it sort of the way she sort of explains it, is you have the field, whatever you want to call it, God, the field. The way it starts, it's calm, it's unconditional love, it's there. And as the Eastern traditions say, once the vibration starts, the consciousness starts to vibrate, the illusion starts. And that all of the physical world is vibration of consciousness, but it's all consciousness. And when people have the life after death or the near-death experience, they go back and they say, it was calm, it was still, unconditional love, and it was beautiful. And they say, I've returned to where I began. And so you go to this whole thing, is that consciousness, it's like, we always have to get away from the fact that there is this, and there's this, and there's this. It's all consciousness, it's all a verb, it's all developing, and everything's happening inside consciousness. So the beings come, we have to think, we think all there is a physical world. So you get the thing where, like the Chandler Bashar says, we come to you in your dreams because now you're in our world. And we have to realize that the beings, whoever they are, whether they're connected to spirits, ghosts, it's all seems to be.
And they're also conscious.
Yeah, well,
they're also conscious.
Everything's conscious. And I would say everything in the universe is conscious. So they can come in. So they're in this higher realm. They can come in, they can become physical, and then they can go back. And I have this one guy, I have the interview I did with this guy from Israel, who talks about the beings are in his room. They give him the message, and they tell him he's got to write a book on oneness. They download all this material in his head, and then when they leave, they gather in a circle, and they hold hands, and they start to move around in a circle, and they go faster and faster and faster, and these beings are going around in his room, and suddenly they become light, and the light gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and boop, they're gone. So the question is it a ball of light? And is it a physical?
It's all of it. It's all of it.
So they can move from the ball of light to the physical and move back. We think there's just the physical universe, and that's when you get into the UFO thing and you see the paranormal phenomena, the manifestations, the apports, the synchronicities, and you realize something's wrong with the physical worldview. It's not just a physical world, and they're showing us that there's this other aspect of consciousness that is much more. Able to do all this sort of stuff. There's nothing paranormal, there's nothing unusual. It's just we don't understand what they're doing. They understand more than we do. And so that's where I say, you forget about what the government knows. Who cares if the government knows or the government doesn't know? Who cares about the videos and stuff like that?
I know it's really true. It's true.
It basically, it's the only people you need to talk to are the people who are interacting with the intelligence. The videos all the videos are going to tell you is something's going on. Something's strange. Yeah, okay, it looks pretty weird. But if you want to know, you're not going to learn by looking at a photograph or picking up a piece of metal. You're going to look by talking to people who are interacting with the beings, because the beings are telling us what's going on. 40% of all experiencers say at one point they knew the answer to everything in the universe. And I've asked some of them, I've talked to them, I said, well, how do you know there was some, not 7, 8, 9 on the far side of the universe they forgot to tell you about? And they'll do the same thing. I had my noetic experience. They'll say the same thing. They'll say, I'm not sure, but I just know. It comes with absolute knowledge, absolute certainty.
And that's the noetic experience, right?
And 42% of all experiencers say they have mathematical, scientific, or technical material in their head. 14% they've been flown the ship. And I say to people, don't you think you should talk to these people? And they'll say, oh, it's just anecdotal, it's just stories. Well, everything's anecdotal, everything's a story. If somebody said they knew the answer to everything in the universe, why would you not try to hack that intelligence and get in there? It doesn't make any sense that you would not talk to people who are interacting and are getting this noetic material. whether it's, you know, through downloads or dreams or however they're communicating it. We just ignore these people, and we're making the total wrong mistake. We're worried about what the government does. We want free energy, and I say this is absolutely nuts. It's all free energy. The sun doesn't charge for energy. It's all free energy, but we want money. We want toys. We're going to make some money out of this thing, and it's really, in the end, it's really got nothing to do with it. You're not taking your money with you. In the end, it's going to be this whole thing about why are we here, and some people like Jacques Vallée have picked up on this earlier. You and I picked up. And since 2012, and you remember back, they said 2012 was the year it was all going to shift.
Right, exactly.
And now I look back and I go, well, that might happen in 2012. And my friend Chris Bledsoe has this lady, he calls her the Lady of Light, that comes to him in 2012. And a lot of events happened in 2012. And now I can see maybe there was a shift in 2000, because I was a different person before 2012. I had no interest in this at all. And it came with this absolute certainty that made me say, you got to chase this. I couldn't think for a couple days. Every time this happens, I just wander around and I go like, wow, and your mind just changes. And that's what happens is people get belief systems, but when you get a noetic experience, it shifts you like that. It makes you change your belief systems. Otherwise, if you don't have the experiences, most people just they have whatever religious view or scientific view, and they just keep repeating their view through their whole life. But you and I have had these experiences where we've interacted with these people, and it shifted our belief system to say, oh, that makes sense.
So you think that the UFO phenomena is there to wake us up?
Yep, to train us.
Because there has to be a reason why. Yeah. And then it picks, or do you think it picks certain people, or do you think we agreed to do it?
Well,
or do
that comes down to the multiple life thing. If it's a multiple life, then people, like, there was one thing, there was 37% of all experiences, people who have encountered the beings have had a near-death experience. And they were going to set up a committee. And I said, well, what are you setting up a committee for? It's very obvious. I was assuming it's one life. If it's one life, then that was random events. But if it was multiple lives, you agreed to be an experiencer, and you agreed to have a near-death experience to learn something. And so you have this sort of where people sort of twist it around and get it messed up. So yeah.
And you also, I've heard you say, the most people, because we get frustrated as researchers, I especially get, I say nobody really cares. We can go and explain everything and talk about all the cases, but in the end, you were saying people lead lives of quiet desperation, which is what the poet said. And it is for a certain number of people to kind of bring attention to the bottom line, which is this has to do with us. It has to do with everything that's living. It has to do with humanity. We're all connected to one thing, which the Eastern religions already have been talking about.
And when I look at it, I see when I lecture to or talk to experiences, I see higher level beings. I see higher level spiritual beings who came in to do this, whatever. And most people, you have to have empathy for them. Like we were the other night at the Colorado State, and they were all, there was big, beer bashes and tailgates and people going to the football game. And that's the life of quiet desperation, but that's their life. They haven't had the experience, and you have to have empathy that they're in their world. The problem with us is when you suddenly realize what's going on, the Bible says too much is given, much is expected.
Exactly.
Edgar Casey said, knowledge not used to sin. And that was always drives me, is like, if you knew when you go to the other side, you're not going to be able to say, oh, the dog ate my homework, my mother-in-law made me upset or whatever. They're going to go, time out. This is about you. What did you do? And so you and I have the onus that if you have the knowledge, you have to share that knowledge, because you've been given this knowledge, or you're a being who has brought this knowledge in with you, and you've agreed to this sort of thing. And so we have the responsibility to realize where we are and do what we can. And that's all you can really do. You can't really think you're going to convince anybody. You just do what you think you're going to do, and do the best you can. And almost like this idea of try to live the life that you can defend when you finally leave here.
That's so true and so profound. It really is a great way that you articulate this, because even in my personal life, I haven't done all this for disclosure. I haven't done it for the President of the United States to announce that UFO. I already know all this stuff. And I know because I've worked with great people. I started with Ellen Hynek. I've talked to so many people. I know this stuff. And then I realized, I think both of us realized that then it's about us. And we go back and say, well, it's not even about all that stuff that we did. It's a personal thing. It's about us. It's what our role is. And what you said, the more that's given to us, the greater the responsibility.
Yeah.
So you and I are trying to shift even our own colleagues that haven't gone there into the aspect of consciousness. Now that doesn't mean that we're not going to do research. My God, I've got like 5 or 6 cases. And you still working with documents with Stanton Friedman's.
Yeah, every once in a while, for whatever
yeah.
reason, I keep getting dragged back in it.
Yeah,
and I always
just
say like,
Friedman's
there's always some
archives.
force that drags you in to go do this. You know?
You go do this. Yeah,
Like I've had 2 messages from aliens, and both turned out to be books. And it's sort of like, so when somebody gets somebody says there's a message for you from an alien, I go, make sure you write it down. Get it. What exactly are they saying? And I realize that this stuff actually happens in the real world. People think you're crazy. But when you get in this world, and you've had these experiences too, where the phone is ringing, where there's things happening, paranormal stuff, and that's where I'm in now. Is it's not just a UFO phenomena that I'm into now, the manifestations in Apports. So I'll go, as I did when we had the dinner the other night. I'll say to the girl, she said, I had a UFO sighting. Oh, tell me. I was 14 years old. I say, okay, whatever. And then I say, do you ever have any stuff fly around your house? Do you ever have any stuff appear and disappear? All the time. And that's the thing, is you realize it's not just a physical world. It's this thing where they're giving messages, where they're dropping stuff, and it's this synchronicity, and everything's tied together.
It's language of it.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. I want to cut this part